Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this Flaskup.com Mists of Pandaria raiding guide. And in this video we're going to be taking a look at the normal mode version of the Fallen Protectors in the Siege of Orgrimmar raid. Now in order to complete this fight you're going to want to take 2 tanks, 2 to 3 healers, and the remaining a mixture of both ranged and melee DPS. It doesn't really matter. Now this fight is a council type fight where you'll fight 3 different Pandaren, and unfortunately they don't share a health pool, but they don't have much health themselves. It's around 113 million on 10-man normal mode. And you should also keep in mind that these bosses share an ability called Bond of the Golden Lotus. Now this is kind of a massive part of the fight because what it means is that each of the 3 bosses must be brought down to 1% remaining health or 1 remaining health at the same time. When they reach 1% remaining health, each of them will begin to cast Bond of the Golden Lotus, and if any of the other protectors are still in combat at this point, then a certain percentage of their maximum health will be restored upon completing the cast of the Bond of the Golden Lotus. However, if you're to bring all 3 of the protectors to 1% health simultaneously, then you will end the fight and restore clarity to their mind, so to speak. If you'd noticed, these are the rat bastards that were giving you dailies at the start of the expansion, so I think we should kill them instead of letting them live because of this bloody bond shit. But nevertheless, we'll carry on with the guide as normal. Each of these bosses also have kind of similar mechanics in the sense that when they reach 66% and 33% remaining health, they will each enter a desperate measures phase, and during these phases different abilities will be cast outside of their normal ability range. In the following guide we're going to take a look at each of the 3 bosses individually and how to counter their abilities, and then near the end of the guide we'll take a look at some kind of general rules of thumb for this encounter. First of all we're going to take a look at Rook Stonetoe, and at all points during the fight Rook should be faced away from the raid due to his frontal cone ability Vengeful Strikes. Now this ability is very hard hitting, and if it does come into contact with any non-tank player then it could potentially kill them with ease. It might also be worth considering using a cooldown on your tank when this ability is active. His next ability is called Corrupted Brew, and this will target a random player with a bolt of brew or a keg of brew, whatever you want to call it, and this will inflict a certain amount of shadow damage to that player, and it will also slow anyone that gets hit by it by 65% for 15 seconds. Now this has got a fairly long travel time on it, so when you see the animation on the ground you should kind of move away from it as soon as possible. Anyone that does get hit by it will gain a movement speed debuff, and they may also have issues avoiding his corruption kick ability, which we'll speak about in a minute. His next ability is called Clash, and this will cause Rook to effectively pull a player to him, and as soon as that player comes into contact with Rook he will begin spinning and casting his corruption kick. Now when he casts his corruption kick and starts spinning, he will start dealing quite high amounts of damage to anyone that is within a 10-yard radius, so when you do all get pulled in, you will want to run away as fast as possible, even if it does mean using some kind of a speed increase cooldown. The person that he chooses to clash with is at random, however it probably won't be a tank. And now we're going to move on to take a look at Rook's Desperate Measures abilities. Now as previously mentioned, he will enter a Desperate Measures phase when he reaches 66 and 33% remaining health, and during his phase he will summon 3 mobs that you will have to kill in order to get Rook to reappear in the fight. The first mob that will spawn is called an Embodied Gloom, and this casts an interruptible spell called Corruption Shock, and it would be very beneficial to your raid if you could interrupt as many of these as possible in order to reduce the overall raid damage that's going on. The second mob is called an Embodied Misery, and this mob will have to be tanked. Now the Misery will cast an ability called Defiled Ground fairly often, and it will also knock the tank back when it is cast, so they need to make sure they are kind of avoiding it. If they get hit, it doesn't matter too much, they will take quite a lot of physical damage though, so they do need to keep that in mind. Once the Defiled Ground has been cast, it will leave a mark on the ground, so they do need to make sure they aren't standing in that. And it does also have quite a long cast time on it, so there should really be no reason for not moving out of it at all. The third and final mob is called an Embodied Sorrow. Now this mob will target whoever is the highest on threat with her nuking ability, and she'll place an arrow on a player's head, and then after a cast time, that player will be hit for over 1,000,000 damage. This ability is called Inferno Blast, and the idea is that you need to kind of stack up on top of the player that gets the debuff on them, and the damage will be split out amongst the players that are stacked up. It's fairly obvious who does get marked with this ability, as they have several yellowy orange rings around them at the time. Now when it comes to a kill priority for these mobs, you want to make sure that you're killing the embodied gloom first, because this will be dealing the most damage to your raid. And then once the gloom's been killed, you want to move on to kill the sorrow, because again this will be dealing quite a moderate amount of damage to your raid. And then finally you'll want to kill off the embodied misery. Now this is because the misery will only cast one ability, and it can easily be avoided by the tank really, and other than casting the defiled ground, it will only melee your tank for a small amount of damage. Now we're going to move on to take a look at the next Pandaren, who goes by the name of He Softfoot, and he will cast an ability called Gouge on the tank that he is currently being tanked by, and at this point in time the tank will want to do their best to make sure they're turned away from He Softfoot, because if he's facing him when he casts Gouge, it will incapacitate them for 6 seconds. However, if they're facing away, it will just knock them back, so you ideally want to take the knockback over the incapacitate. It's kind of a big deal, so to speak. His next ability is called Garrote, and He Softfoot will just jump to a random player and garrote them, and this is just moderate damage that you will have to heal through, and you can't remove the debuff that it applies onto the player. Now He Softfoot is actually a master of the poisons, would you believe it? And healers will need to be aware of when he applies certain poisons to his weapons, because the tank could start taking spiky damage. And the first poison is called Instant Poison, and this will cause successful melee attacks to inflict an additional amount of nature damage, and it's also got a 3-second cooldown on it. You just need to make sure you are healing through this, and if the tank starts taking too much damage, then you may want to consider using a cooldown in order to reduce it. Now he will also coat his weapons with a noxious poison, and this will cause successful melee attacks to create pools of poison on the ground. Naturally, just like any other mechanic in World of Warcraft that's on the ground, you just need to move out of this poison pool and wait for it to disappear before you move back to where you currently were. And now we're going to take a look at He Softfoot's Desperate Measures phase, and just like with the other two Pandaren, he will enter this phase at 66 and 33% remaining health. Now, there isn't much that really happens in this phase, other than he will place a mark of anguish on a player. Now, this will be placed on a player at the start of the phase, and that player will begin to take shadow damage from the mark, and they will also be fixated on by a mob that spawns called an Embodied Anguish. Now, this mob can deal very high amounts of damage, so you may want to use personal cooldowns, and if you begin to take too much damage, then you should possibly use even more powerful cooldowns, maybe from your healers. However, what you can do is pass the Mark of Anguish to another player instead of blowing all your cooldowns, and this is done by the use of an extra ability button that will appear on your screen. Now, for some reason, and I don't know why this is, you can pass this mark to a tank. So as soon as the phase starts, the ideal thing to do is pass the mark to your tank and let him just tank the Embodied Anguish. It makes this Desperate Measures a lot easier, and then all your DPS have to do is to kill off the Embodied Anguish in order to end the Desperate Measures phase. It's quite simple, really. And finally, we're going to move on to take a look at Sun Tenderheart, and it's very important to know that throughout this fight you will not need to actually tank Sun Tenderheart, which does make things a little bit easier for you. However, she will unfortunately focus her attacks on random players in the raid, which will need to be well managed in order to reduce the amount of total damage she does to your raid. Now, her first ability that she will target on a player is called Seer, and this will cause that player to cause an explosion of shadow magic around them, inflicting shadow damage every second to all enemies within 5 yards around the target. Now, what this means is, when the player gets the Seer debuff on them, they should simply move away from everyone else in order to make sure they're not dealing damage to their friends or allies or people that they're currently in the raid with. The damage from other abilities and this ability can start to mount up if players don't handle it well. Now her next ability is called Shadow Word Bane, and this will put a word of misery upon multiple targets, inflicting a moderate amount of shadow damage every 3 seconds for 18 seconds. And every time this effect deals damage, it will jump to an additional target up to a total of 3 times. Now this can and most likely will be cast on multiple targets at any one time, so as soon as it goes onto players, you will want it to be dispelled as soon as possible. You don't want this to be jumping around your raid because it will be dealing a lot of unnecessary damage. Now you need to also make sure that you are dispelling it before its first tick of damage in order to prevent it from jumping to other players and then repeating this process on and on. His next ability is called Calamity, and this has got a cast time on it thankfully, so you will want to make sure that everyone in your raid is topped off for the ability. And this will call forth a Great Calamity, striking your players for 30% of their maximum health as shadow damage. However, this ability will also remove any Shadow Word Banes from players, so it kind of works for you and against you. For you because it will remove any stacks of Shadow Word Bane that you are unable to dispel from players, but against you because it's going to take away 30% of your health. And now we're going to take a look at Sun Tenderheart's Desperate Measures phase. Now when Sun Tenderheart enters the Desperate Measures, the entire room will go dark and a protective bubble called a meditative field, that was a tongue twister for me, will form in the centre of the room. Now everyone in your raid will want to move into the centre of the room because during this phase Sun Tenderheart will enter a dark meditation and begin to deal damage to everyone in the raid every second. This is a fairly high amount of damage over time, however it can be heavily reduced by ensuring you're standing in the meditative field because this will reduce the shadow damage that you take to 50% less, I think it is. Yeah, it's 50% less, half the damage you will be taking. Now throughout this phase, 2 adds called Embodied Despair and Embodied Desperation will spawn at the different sides of the room, and these begin to spawn waves of smaller adds that will run into your raid. Any damage that is dealt to these smaller adds will be copied back to the bigger adds, so therefore it's best to kind of let your ranged single target the bigger adds that are up, and then when the smaller adds run into the raid, you can have your melee focus them down and cleave and AoE them off in order to further deal damage to the bigger adds. It saves the melee having to run out of the protective bubble and take additional damage that isn't necessary. Now also during this phase, despite the reductions, your raid will also be taking a lot of raid-wide damage, so you will want to save any stronger healing cooldowns that you have for this Desperate Measures phase, and you should also keep in mind that her Meditation Spike ability will be going off during this phase and will need to be healed through. The Meditation Spike will fire a bolt of shadow energy that will inflict a high amount of damage upon impact to enemies within 6 yards, and since you are all stacked up, then the damage is going to be hitting everyone in the raid more than likely. Just as a side note for your tanks as well, you should also make sure that Rook Stonetoe is not facing into the raid at this point because of his Vengeful Strike's frontal cone ability. So that's going to do it for this Mists of Pandaria raiding guide. If you would like to view a written version of this guide, then you can head on over to flaskup.com or follow the link in the video description below. Additionally, if you are interested in any of our other Mists of Pandaria raiding guides, then you can click on one of the annotations that are on screen now. However, you will only be able to click on them once the guide does become available. As always, thank you for watching, and if you are interested in future Mists of Pandaria raiding guides, then please do feel free to subscribe to the channel.